When inventory piles up, it isn't just metal collecting dust. It's a flashing neon sign that human behavior, business judgment, and basic economics have all quietly gone wrong at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, let me be painfully clear. When new cars are piling up on lots and demand is dying, that's not a quirky little market hiccup. That's the world telling you in big bold letters that something fundamental is out of whack. People don't stop buying cars because they suddenly discovered that walking is good for their health. They stop because the incentives are misaligned, the prices are absurd, debt is bloated, and confidence has evaporated. And as usual, everyone acts surprised even though the signals were glowing red for years. You don't need a PhD in economics to understand this. You only need common sense, which is in shorter supply than lithium batteries these days. The auto industry, like many others, has been seduced by short-term thinking leverage, glossy marketing, and a fantasy that customers will tolerate endless price hikes forever. But capitalism, in its brutal honesty, eventually corrects arrogance. If you want to understand what happens next, don't ask the forecasters. Half of them couldn't forecast yesterday. Instead, understand human behavior, understand misaligned incentives, and understand that when things look too good for too long, they probably are. ChatGPT said, "When you look at an industry drowning in its own inventory, you're not witnessing some mysterious force of nature. You're staring at a monument to human folly." Businesses have this uncanny ability to convince themselves that the good times will keep rolling forever, even when the indicators are shouting the opposite. Overproduction is almost always born from overconfidence, and overconfidence is almost always born from ignoring history. And let me tell you something, ignoring history is like ignoring gravity. You only get away with it until you don't, and then the fall is spectacular. The auto industry has done this dance many times before, each cycle wrapped in a new justification. People want bigger trucks. People will pay more for technology. People love the brand. Well, people love a lot of things until the bill shows up. The fundamental mistake is assuming demand is limitless simply because it was strong yesterday. Human demand is elastic, fragile, and driven by psychology more than spreadsheets. The moment people feel squeezed, they stop buying, and suddenly those ambitious production lines look like the world's most expensive museum exhibit. But what really drives this kind of miscalculation is a peculiar tendency for executives to believe their own propaganda. You put enough glossy charts in front of them, add a few consultants who charge too much to say very little, and suddenly everyone is convinced that building more cars is the smart thing to do. Capacity expands, factories hum, and no one stops to ask whether the customer actually wants another 50,000 shiny metal boxes dumped onto the market. The assumption is always that demand will magically appear. This is the same kind of thinking that leads people to jump off cliffs because they're convinced their homemade wings will work. It's foolish optimism dressed up as strategy. And when reality finally intrudes, it intrudes brutally. Cars don't evaporate. They sit, they depreciate, and they tie up capital that could have been used more wisely. Inventory is like cholesterol. A little is necessary, but too much will kill you. The problem gets worse when businesses forget the most important economic principle. You are not entitled to demand. You have to earn it every single day with value, affordability, and judgment. But instead of doing that, companies drift into fantasy. They see strong sales and think it's because of their genius, not because of temporary factors like cheap financing or suppressed supply from past disruptions. They ignore that demand is often artificially elevated and will return to normal or worse, dip below it once conditions change. When an entire industry behaves like a gambler on a lucky streak, don't be surprised when the tables turn. That's not bad luck. It's an inevitable consequence of arrogance. Overproduction doesn't happen because the world changed suddenly. It happens because people stop paying attention. Now, let's talk about debt-driven consumption. Because if overproduction is the disease, Easy credit is the drug that made everyone think the fever was a sign of health. For more than a decade, people bought cars not because they could afford them, but because they could finance them. When money was practically free, lenders were throwing loans around like confetti at a cheap wedding. Low interest rates created the illusion of affordability. A car that should have been financially out of reach suddenly looked manageable because the monthly payment seemed tolerable. Consumers didn't get wealthier, credit just got cheaper. And when people mistake credit for prosperity, they fall into traps they don't recognize until the bill comes due. It's a lot like stuffing yourself with sugar and calling it nutrition. You feel energized until you collapse. This situation was always going to reverse because it had to. Cheap borrowing was an artificial stimulant, and artificial stimulants always wear off. Once interest rates rose, everyone had to face the reality they'd been ignoring. Suddenly, that same car that felt affordable at 2% interest became a financial anvil around the neck at 7 or 8%. Monthly payments ballooned, and consumers realized they were paying luxury prices for non-luxury goods. You can't expect people to behave irrationally forever. Eventually they wake up, look at the numbers, and say, "No, thank you." And when millions of people have that realization at the same time, demand doesn't just slow, it collapses. It's not surprising. It's mathematics. One of the biggest misunderstandings in modern consumer culture is that people buy based on price. They don't. They buy based on monthly payments. This is the financial equivalent of choosing a spouse based solely on whether they smile in photographs. It's incomplete at best and catastrophic at worst. For years, lenders and manufacturers exploited this psychological weakness. Instead of lowering prices, they stretched loans. 5-year loans became 6-year loans, then 7-year loans, and now we're marching toward 8-year loans, as if that's sane. It's not sane. It's desperation. You don't fix affordability by spreading it thinner. You fix it by making things cheaper or making people richer. But the industry chose the shortcut. They always do. And shortcuts inevitably lead to cliffs. Debt-driven consumption also distorts market signals, and distorted signals create bad decisions. When people buy more cars because credit is cheap, manufacturers interpret it as genuine demand instead of borrowed demand. They ramp up production, hire more workers, expand facilities, and congratulate themselves for their brilliance. But what they're really doing is building capacity for demand that never existed in the first place. They are mistaking temporary buoyancy for structural strength. When the financing environment changes, and it always does, the artificial demand evaporates, leaving behind an oversupply problem they themselves manufactured. This is like mistaking a sugar rush for permanent energy and deciding to run a marathon. The crash is guaranteed. The painful irony is that debt-driven consumption doesn't just hurt consumers, it hurts businesses too. When companies rely on easy credit to move products, they become addicted to the conditions that make that possible. The moment the credit environment tightens, they're left stranded. They can't lower prices without destroying margins. They can't slow production without triggering layoffs and financial strain. And they can't force consumers to borrow more because consumers are already stretched thin. This is the kind of situation that creates recessions. Not because the economy is inherently broken, but because too many decisions were built on the assumption that borrowing would stay cheap forever. That assumption is about as intelligent as assuming you'll stay warm in winter because summer was hot. There's also a psychological dimension to this mess that people routinely overlook. When consumers feel financially uncertain, they don't buy big-ticket items. It doesn't matter how badly they want a new car. They prioritize survival over comfort. And if you've been paying attention to the last few years, financial uncertainty has been piling up like snowdrifts. Inflation has taken a bite out of real incomes. Housing has become a circus of absurd prices, and everyday necessities cost more than ever. But over in the boardrooms, the assumption was that customers would keep spending as if none of this mattered. That's not optimism, that's delusion. Consumers aren't complicated. When they feel squeezed, they stop buying. When they stop buying, inventory piles up. When inventory piles up, the companies that ignored reality get punished. That's not cruelty. That's cause and effect. The deeper problem is that credit-enabled demand created a false sense of stability. When people could borrow cheaply, it masked the fact that the underlying economics were weakening. Businesses mistook this facade for real strength and built entire strategies around it. But when the foundation of anything, whether a building or a business, rests on something temporary, collapse is not a question of if, but when. The car market was propped up by the scaffolding of cheap money, and when that scaffolding was kicked away, the structure wobbled. Now everyone acts shocked. They shouldn't be. The signals were blinking red long before the inventory started piling up. People just chose not to look. Debt-driven consumption is one of those things that looks smart until you actually examine it. It's the economic equivalent of eating dessert for breakfast because it tastes good. Eventually, the consequences show up, and they're rarely pleasant. The industry got addicted to the easy rush of financing-driven sales, and now it's paying the price. Consumers got addicted to the illusion of affordability, and now they're waking up from the dream. And through all of this, the laws of economics remained unchanged. You can distort them temporarily, but you can't ignore them forever. The real tragedy is that this cycle was entirely avoidable. It didn't require genius-level intelligence to see that cheap credit wouldn't last or that overproduction was a terrible idea. It required humility, discipline, and respect for reality, three things that are perpetually in short supply. Instead, the industry convinced itself that demand was guaranteed, that consumers would tolerate any price, and that the credit environment was a permanent gift. That kind of thinking is how industries collapse, not because the world conspired against them, but because they conspired against themselves by ignoring basic principles. If you want to understand what's happening with new cars piling up and no one buying, you don't need complicated theories. You just need to recognize that when businesses overproduce out of overconfidence and consumers overbuy using borrowed money, both parties are headed for a reckoning. And that reckoning doesn't arrive gradually, it arrives all at once. When people talk about inflation, they often make it sound like some exotic monster that crawled out of a cave one morning and decided to torment humanity. But inflation isn't mysterious. It's the logical consequence of too much money chasing too few goods. And when inflation hits, the first thing to get punished is not food or toothpaste. It's the big-ticket durable goods, the things people can postpone buying when they feel squeezed. That's why the car market is always a great place to see economic reality in its purest, harshest form. When prices get out of hand, people walk away. It's that simple. You don't need a Nobel Prize to understand it. You just need the ability to add and subtract. The car industry made the fatal mistake of ignoring the simple truth that consumers will tolerate rising prices only up to a point. Once that line is crossed, demand collapses, not gradually, violently. In the years leading up to the current inventory pileups, auto prices soared far faster than wages. Cars went from being expensive to being absurd. It wasn't subtle. The average buyer could look at a new car sticker price and feel their stomach drop. You can't build a sustainable market on the assumption that people will swallow any price you throw at them. That's not capitalism, that's wishful thinking wearing a suit. People forget that durable goods aren't necessities in the same way groceries are. If pasta goes up 20%, people grumble and still buy pasta. If a car goes up 20%, or in this cycle, 40 or 50%, they simply refuse. They patch the old car, delay the purchase, or buy used. That's the problem with high-priced items. They depend on psychological confidence. And confidence evaporates the moment people feel cheated. The industry should have known that. It's happened dozens of times in the past century. But every generation convinces itself that this time is different. It never is. One of the amusing things about business cycles is how predictably people misread them. When prices rise for a while, executives convince themselves it's justified. They create elaborate narratives about premiumization, feature value, and technological leapfrogging. But these are just fancy words to avoid admitting the truth. They raised prices because they could, not because customers were getting commensurate value. It's human nature to rationalize greed. The problem comes when reality steps in and reminds everyone that you can't expand prices indefinitely while incomes stagnate. Even the most loyal customer eventually says no. It's remarkable how people forget about elasticity. Elasticity isn't complicated. It just means that demand changes when prices change. The car market is extraordinarily elastic because cars are expensive and heavily financed. When interest rates were low, elasticity was hidden. But once financing costs exploded, elasticity returned with a vengeance. Suddenly, people realized that a $45,000 car might now cost $60,000 or more over the life of the loan. Even the financially illiterate could sense the shift. Humans don't need a calculator to recognize a bad deal. They feel it in their bones. Inflation also exposes another delusion, the belief that customers will keep upgrading to newer, flashier technology, no matter the cost. That fantasy might work for smartphones, but cars are not smartphones. You can't charge people premium prices for features they don't truly value. The industry became obsessed with stuffing cars full of screens, sensors, subscriptions, and over-the-air gimmicks. The assumption was that consumers would be dazzled and willing to pay forever increasing amounts for the privilege. But when inflation hits, people stop caring about bells and whistles. They care about practicality, reliability, and total cost. Suddenly, all that tech becomes a liability rather than a selling point. It adds price without adding perceived value. And nothing collapses demand faster than a mismatch between what companies think people value and what they actually value. The truth is, durable goods feel the full force of economic reality because they require long-term commitment. A car is not a spontaneous purchase. It's a calculation. And when that calculation begins to look unreasonable, people sit on their wallets. Inflation is the great revealer. It reveals who was pricing responsibly and who was padding margins. It reveals which companies understood their customers and which companies lived in fantasy. It reveals which buyers were financially stable and which were living on borrowed time. The moment inflation collides with overpriced goods, the illusion shatters. That's what we're seeing now. This brings us to the next painful truth. The industry's infatuation with technology has clouded its judgment. Innovation is wonderful, but only when it serves the customer. Innovation that serves the ego of executives or the fantasies of Wall Street is worthless. There's a widespread belief that if you slap enough technology into a car, touchscreens, self-driving beta software, voice assistants, and 17 microprocessors, the customer will unquestionably view it as progress. That's nonsense. Customers don't want complexity for complexity's sake. They want value. They want dependability. They want something that works. A car used to be a relatively simple machine. Now it's a rolling computer with thousands of failure points. And while some of that progress is genuinely beneficial, much of it is gratuitous. The industry got swept up in a technological arms race, trying to outdo each other with features most customers either don't use or don't trust. Everyone sold the dream of a high-tech future, but very few stopped to consider whether customers were willing to pay for that future, especially in an inflationary environment where every dollar matters. The obsession with electric vehicles is another example of misreading the landscape. EVs are a marvelous engineering achievement, but the industry jumped from innovation to overcommitment in record time. Instead of building a gradual transition based on real consumer adoption, they dumped billions into accelerating a shift most buyers weren't ready for. Charging infrastructure, battery cost, cold weather performance, grid reliability, none of these were solved problems. And yet the industry behaved as if the entire world would embrace EVs overnight. That's not strategy, that's hallucination. When companies chase trends without understanding their limits, they create markets that are ahead of their time. Being too early is just as bad as being too late. If customers see EVs as expensive, inconvenient, or unreliable, it doesn't matter how many features you add, they simply won't buy them. No amount of technological wizardry can overcome the basic truth that people won't adopt a technology that doesn't fit their needs or their budget. The gap between corporate ambition and consumer reality widened every year, and now the consequences are showing up in unsold inventory and panic discounting. But this problem isn't limited to EVs. The industry embraced subscription-based features as if customers would cheerfully pay monthly fees to activate heated seats or unlock navigation. This isn't innovation, it's nickel and diming disguised as modernization. Consumers have tolerated subscription creep in digital products, but applying the same tactic to physical goods, especially essential ones, is insulting. And when inflation tightens budgets, consumers become unforgiving. They cut anything that feels unnecessary, exploitative, or wasteful. Companies that bet on squeezing customers instead of serving them always find themselves in trouble during downturns. The deeper issue is that many companies abandon common sense in pursuit of novelty. Common sense says customers prioritize affordability and reliability over futuristic gadgets. Common sense says technology should simplify life, not complicate it. Common sense says innovation should lower costs, not raise them. But common sense is an endangered species in corporate boardrooms. People chase trends, presentations, and grand visions instead of listening to basic economic principles. That's how you end up with cars that are more expensive but not meaningfully better, more advanced but not more desirable, more impressive on paper but less compelling in reality. Technology hype doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't fill the demand gap. It doesn't fix the affordability crisis. And it certainly doesn't compensate for the shock consumers feel when they see monthly payments that could rival a mortgage. The industry convinced itself that technology would be a magical growth engine, but technology is only valuable when paired with prudence. When you ignore prudence, you get chaos. The real problem is that businesses like to chase shiny objects. A new technology creates excitement. Investors applaud. Media writes glowing articles. Executives receive praise for being visionary. Meanwhile, the fundamentals deteriorate quietly. Costs rise. Complexity increases. Customers grow confused or frustrated. The very innovations meant to differentiate the product end up alienating the buyer. In the rush to dazzle the world, companies forget the most important rule of capitalism. The customer decides what matters, not the manufacturer. Technology also has a bad habit of creating false confidence. When a company feels innovative, it often believes it can push prices higher without backlash. But innovation is not a license for price gouging. At some point, customers stop caring how many chips or sensors are stuffed into their cars. They care about what they have always cared about: affordability, durability, maintenance costs, and total ownership experience. Technology that makes ownership more expensive is not progress. It's regression masked by marketing. Another overlooked point is that complexity increases fragility. The more intricate a system becomes, the more ways it can fail. And when it fails, it costs more to fix. Consumers are not stupid. They can sense when a product is becoming too complicated for its own good. That sense is magnified during inflationary periods, when every repair bill stings more than usual. People start seeking stability. They prefer things that work. They avoid things that break. And in the current market, many technologically overloaded cars are breaking in more ways than one: financially, mechanically, and psychologically. The mismatch between industry ambition and consumer priorities is now colliding with economic reality in a spectacular fashion. Inventories are piling up because prices rose too fast, and the technology packed into these cars isn't convincing people to pay those prices. The industry thought it could innovate its way out of affordability constraints. It can't. You don't solve an affordability problem with complexity. You solve it by building better, simpler, more efficient products that people can actually buy without feeling financially reckless. Inflation punishes arrogance, and technology exposes it. When you combine both at the same time, you get a reckoning. And this reckoning isn't a surprise. It's the inevitable result of ignoring timeless economic principles while chasing trends that feel exciting but lack foundation. Durable goods always reveal the truth, and technology, when misused, accelerates that revelation. The simple reality is that you can't create sustainable demand by adding cost without adding proportionate value. You can't force technology on people faster than they're willing to adopt it. You can't outrun the limits of human budgets by dazzling them with new features, and you certainly can't price your way into prosperity when inflation is already eating people alive. The industry forgot that restraint is just as important as innovation. And now, in a market awash with vehicles no one wants or can afford, the consequences of that forgetfulness are becoming painfully clear. When consumer confidence breaks, you don't need a complicated econometric model to understand what happens next. You just need a functioning pair of eyes. Confidence is the glue that holds every modern economy together, especially one built on long-term financing, leveraged purchases, and the perpetual hope that tomorrow will be better than today. When that hope gets dented, even slightly, consumers behave with astonishing speed and clarity. They pull back, they wait, they defer decisions. They shift from expansion to survival mode almost overnight. And once they've made that psychological shift, you can throw all the advertising, incentives, and salesmanship in the world at them. None of it works. A nervous consumer is not a buying consumer, and pretending otherwise is a great way to turn an inventory lot into a parking museum. People forget how profoundly emotional economic decisions really are. Buying a car is not just about horsepower or cup holders. It's a decision that represents stability, confidence, and the belief in one's future earning power. If someone is unsure about their job security, the economy, or the direction of their finances, the first thing they cut is discretionary big-ticket purchases. A new car sits right at the top of that list. The irony is that consumers don't need to be in a crisis to stop buying, they merely need to feel times uneasy. And in today's environment, with rising rates, volatile markets, political dysfunction, and inflation eating away at the purchasing power of every paycheck, people feel more than uneasy. They feel betrayed by the very system they relied on to stay afloat. Confidence doesn't weaken logically, it weakens symbolically. All it takes is a few signals. The news says layoffs are coming, grocery prices spike again, rental costs jump, a friend loses their job, the stock market throws a tantrum, and suddenly people across the country tighten their belts simultaneously. This isn't a trickle, it's a collective psychological snapping point. Even people who still have money behave as if they don't. Fear is contagious. It jumps from individual to individual faster than any virus, and before long, an entire population decides to hunker down. That's when demand vanishes, not because people don't want cars, but because they no longer trust the future enough to commit to one. The auto industry has a long history of misunderstanding this psychological fragility. They assume consumers are rational calculators who examine data like accountants. They aren't. They behave more like herd animals equipped with credit scores. When the herd senses danger, it moves as one away from risk. And a new car, with its multi-year financing and unpredictable maintenance and insurance costs, feels like a monumental risk during uncertain times. People revert to practicality. They say, let's wait, let's see what happens. And that instinct, repeated millions of times, is what freezes an entire industry. There's also the simple truth that when confidence cracks, people retreat to repairing what they already own. A car that might have been traded in last year suddenly gets new tires, a new battery, maybe a brake job. It's not because people suddenly developed a sentimental attachment to their 15-year-old sedan, they're just avoiding a financial leap. They're not willing to strap themselves to a 5, 6, or 7-year loan when the ground beneath them feels unstable. That's why mechanics thrive in bad economies. People shift from replacement to maintenance, from desire to necessity, from optimism to prudence. The irony is that companies always behave as if confidence will remain permanently high. They grow their cost structures, their production lines, their marketing budgets, their entire operational DNA based on a psychological condition that is as changeable as the weather. And when the weather turns cold, they find themselves exposed. They discover too late that their entire strategy depended on consumers continuing to behave irrationally long after reality demanded otherwise. When confidence collapses, the industry discovers that it has built a business model on sand. The crucial point here is that confidence doesn't decline smoothly. It collapses suddenly. A market can look healthy on Monday and be in paralysis by Friday. Humans don't downgrade emotions gradually. They flip from optimism to caution like a light switch. Once that switch flips, restoring confidence is 10 times harder than maintaining it in the first place. You can cut prices, offer incentives, wave banners, promise the moon, it doesn't matter. Consumer psychology moves at its own pace, and once trust is broken, it requires far more than clever marketing to restore it. This leads naturally to the sixth keynote, which is perhaps the most important, yet most frequently ignored. When businesses face a crisis of demand, the cure isn't spin, it's sobriety. Sobriety in expectations, sobriety in pricing, sobriety in production, sobriety in strategy. The trouble is that sobriety is precisely what most industries avoid until their backs are against the wall. They prefer delusion. Delusion feels good. It preserves ego. It lets executives stand on stage and say everything is fine. Sobriety, on the other hand, forces you to confront your own mistakes. It forces you to admit that you misread the market, misjudged the consumer, and misallocated your capital. People don't like doing that, especially people who run large corporations. But capitalism does not reward delusion. It rewards discipline. It rewards those who look reality in the face and adjust, not those who cling to a narrative long after the facts have shredded it. When an industry finds itself drowning in unsold inventory, the appropriate reaction is not to double down on the same strategies that caused the mess. Yet that is exactly what many companies do. They ramp up advertising, they introduce gimmicky discounts, they create new financing schemes that disguise the true cost of ownership. They try to paint a smiley face on a burning house. All this accomplishes is delaying the recognition of the problem while making the consequences worse. Real solutions require confronting the fundamentals. The first fundamental is that prices must align with what customers can actually afford, not what companies wish they could afford. The era of endlessly rising prices is over, not because people stopped liking cars, but because economics eventually snaps back. You cannot build indefinitely on the assumption that consumers will tolerate debt loads that outpace their income. Companies need to cut costs, simplify product lines, and produce vehicles people can reasonably buy without feeling financially suicidal. The arrogance of believing the consumer will keep stretching forever is what created this situation. The humility to reverse those mistakes is what is needed next. Sobriety also means acknowledging that complexity for its own sake is a dead end. The industry has spent a decade trying to turn every car into a high-tech gadget. In the process, it has ballooned costs, alienated traditional buyers, and created reliability nightmares that erode trust. Customers don't want cars that behave like malfunctioning computers. They want cars that work. They want simplicity disguised as sophistication, not the other way around. When an industry chases technology faster than the customer wants to adopt it, the outcome is predictable: huge investments met with lukewarm demand, followed by discounting write-downs and panic. Sobriety means admitting that innovation should serve the customer, not the other way around. Another part of sobriety is getting rid of bloated structures built during boom times. When sales are soaring, companies hire too many people, expand too many divisions, build too many facilities, and convince themselves that the party will never end. But capitalism is cyclical. If you prepare for perpetual sunshine, the first storm destroys you. Smart companies cut costs before they're forced to. They streamline operations not because things are bad, but because they know times get bad eventually. This kind of foresight requires discipline, and discipline is rare. Most businesses mistake expansion for success and forget that resilience is built during calm periods, not during crises. Sobriety also means refusing to participate in the delusion that marketing can solve structural problems. Marketing can polish the surface, but it cannot fix affordability, it cannot fix trust, it cannot fix the value equation, and it cannot fix a product that the customer no longer believes in. For years, companies have used branding as a crutch to avoid making hard changes. But during economic stress, branding collapses under the weight of reality. People stop caring about slogans. They care about survival. If your product does not help them survive financially, practically, and psychologically, they won't buy it. No amount of clever messaging will change that. The industry also needs to rediscover the lost art of producing fewer, better products. When times were booming, every company expanded its lineup to absurd levels. The strategy was quantity over quality, variety over clarity. This bloated approach creates inefficiency, confuses customers, and weakens brand identity. Sobriety means shrinking the menu. It means offering fewer cars, but making each of them excellent. It means focusing on reliability, durability, and value, not chasing every niche trend that catches the eye of a consultant. The companies that simplify will survive. The companies that keep sprawling will drown. Perhaps the most important aspect of sobriety is accepting that long-term stability matters more than short-term results. The obsession with quarterly earnings has led to decisions that are disastrous in the long run. Overproduction, inflated pricing, excessive complexity, these are all symptoms of a mindset that values immediate gratification over sustainable strategy. Sobriety requires stepping back and asking, what will make this business healthy a decade from now? The answers are not glamorous. They involve cost, discipline, gradual innovation, respect for the consumer, and humility in the face of market reality. These virtues don't show up on flashy slides, but they build companies that last. There's also a moral dimension to sobriety. When companies inflate prices or push consumers into financial traps, they erode trust. Trust is the most valuable currency in business, and once lost, it is incredibly difficult to regain. Companies that respect their customers, even during hard times, build loyalty that outlasts cycles. Those that exploit their customers lose them forever. Sobriety means understanding that capitalism works best when it is practiced with fairness. Fair pricing, honest products, responsible financing, these are not just ethical choices, they are strategic advantages. Sobriety also demands the courage to resist the crowd. When an entire industry is chasing the same trends, the temptation is to follow blindly. But real strength lies in thinking independently, recognizing when the crowd is wrong, and refusing to be swept up in mass delusion. The companies that survive downturns are the ones that question assumptions, challenge conventional wisdom, and make decisions based on fundamentals, not fads. The industry's mass migration toward over-engineering and overpricing was a herd behavior fueled by momentary optimism. Sobriety means breaking from that herd. The most striking failure of the industry has been its inability to understand the difference between what customers times they want, and what they actually times value asterisk. Surveys, focus groups, and trend reports are all contaminated by noise. Customers may say they want futuristic features, but when inflation strikes and budgets tighten, what they truly value is stability, affordability, and durability. Sobriety means listening to customer behavior, not customer chatter. Behavior always reveals the truth. And current behavior is screaming that the industry's priorities are deeply misaligned with the public's reality. Sobriety is not glamorous. It does not make headlines. It does not excite investors who crave exponential growth curves. But it is the only antidote to the reckless optimism that created the current crisis. When an industry finds itself with too many cars and too few buyers, the solution is not more noise, it's more wisdom. It's acknowledging that humility is not weakness and that realism is not pessimism. It's understanding that sustainable success is built not on hype, but on respect for economic fundamentals and human psychology. When consumer confidence collapses, companies must respond with seriousness, not denial. And when an entire industry has drifted into fantasy, the only path forward is a return to reality. Sobriety is simply the willingness to see things as they are and act accordingly. It is the discipline to correct mistakes, the humility to learn from them, and the judgment to avoid repeating them. In a world where too many businesses chase illusions, the ones that embrace clarity will be the ones that survive.